He was national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, renowned U.S. political scientist Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose books include Strategic Vision, America and the Crisis of Global Power, is with us. Thank you for being with us here on France 24. Joining me, France 24's Mark Perlman as well. Mr. Brzezinski, after Russia's invasion of Crimea, we heard this Tuesday, a short while ago, Barack Obama in The Hague saying Crimea is not going to be taken back by force. Listening to the U.S. president, do you get a sense there's a clear objective?
I think the clear objective is to convince the Russian government that its conduct in the long run is detrimental to Russia's own national interest. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach.
Is Obama going about it the right way so far?
I would say on the whole, yes. Of course, I don't know what is being said privately. I do hope that privately he's conveying to the Russians more explicit concern that if they exaggerate what they have already done, if they try to apply some form of military pressure, either on Ukraine or on Moldova, there will be much more serious consequences for the relationship of the international community and specifically of the United States with Russia, very much potentially damaging long-term Russian interests.
You just mentioned Ukraine and Moldova. What do you think is Vladimir Putin's actual objective? How far do you think he wants to go?
My sense is that he is partially improvising. He reacted in great anger because he felt that the Ukrainian decision, essentially to become increasingly a more democratic Western state, undermined his grand concept, his great quest in terms of the future, namely a Eurasian Union. So he acted in anger, but he also acted very deliberately in such a way that he could protect himself by deniability. His soldiers were dressed like thugs. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore masks. But that made it possible for him, if push came to shove, to disown them, to say they don't represent Russia, and quickly to withdraw them. I hope he hasn't reached a wrong conclusion that some similar stunt can be pulled off regarding either Moldova or, much more seriously, Ukraine as a whole. And we have to convince him, and I think we're doing it in part, that that would be the case, that this would not be very successful for the Russians.
Mr. Brzezinski, you recently compared his actions to those of Adolf Hitler before World War II. Isn't this an exaggeration on your part?
It is obviously an exaggeration in view of what followed. But if you look at the events specifically that I had in mind, namely what he has done in Crimea and what Hitler did, for example, in Austria, the famous Anschluss, in which nobody was killed, but the whole country was incorporated into Germany. There are some striking similarities. The point is to make sure that they don't become more and more dangerous to the international community. And this is why I also argue, incidentally, that in addition to private warnings to him, we should reiterate to Putin our desire for larger accommodation regarding Ukraine, namely that Ukraine can be a country that is helped to be healthy and stable, both by the West and by Russia. And Russia can forsake its objective to include Ukraine in the European Union, in the Eurasian Union, in the Eurasian Union, and we can forsake the ambition of some to have Ukraine in NATO.
I was going to say, on that point, do you agree with the piece recently penned by former U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union, Matlock, who thought that over a period of time, most notably by putting at one point that offer forward of having Ukraine in NATO, that Russia was right to feel perhaps disrespected?
Not really, because there was no imminent plan to have Ukraine in NATO. Ukraine was not applying for membership in NATO. NATO was not inviting Ukraine to join. And we all know that public opinion polls show that a large percentage of the Ukrainians, at least at this stage, have no interest in joining NATO. No, I don't think there was a legitimate provocation for what he did. In his case, he was acting, I think, in anger because Ukraine decided not to, in fact, embrace his so-called Eurasian Union, which is essentially an attempt to restore either the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, many thanks for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Mark Perlman for being with us as well. We hope we can talk to you again very soon here on France 24.